Thank you. And again, thank you for all coming. And I hope those on this side can still see the screen and not just me. So I'm going to play with you a little bit. This is not a history of Jamaica Plain. I have deputized Ralph Waldo Emerson to help me describe an aspect of Jamaica Plain today that I think would make him wish to live here were he alive today. And now, yes, okay. So there's a voluminous, some of you know who are members, there's a voluminous amount of literature about Jamaica Plain. I was actually surprised that I started to Google it, right? Lots of books, more than would fit on this page. Emerson is hardly ever mentioned, every once in a while in passing. Because of course, you know, we think of him as, oh, a Concord guy, way over there, right? But indeed, I will show you how in the 19th century, briefly, and maybe today, he would be a good citizen of Jamaica Plain. So again, there he is, and I'm sort of drawing him into Jamaica Plain, as you will see. So by the way, you may not know, but he did not like being called Ralph. He liked Waldo. So there is Waldo, and we're going to try to find him in and around actually the edges of Jamaica Plain. So before that, just to kind of show you an image of what was described by Gretchen. So we've lived here since right on the corner on Moraine Street since 1989, when moved here shortly before our daughter was born. And we live right there on Moraine Street, you can see right there. So, you know, I've been a teacher, I've been an architect, I've done a lot of work actually at the Longwood Medical area and other places. And I've also kind of authored, most recently, this book. And this book is actually about ideals, sort of old American ideals, and asking the question about how come we don't seem to be living up to many of those ideals, especially recently. And here's an ideal that Waldo Emerson spoke about. He said, I wish for rural strength and religion and city facility and polish. Isn't that interesting? Rural strength and religion and city facility and polish. And this from the guy who wrote Nature, right? I mean, this is what you all know about Waldo, right? In the wilderness, I find something more dear and connate. I had to look up what the meaning of connate was. How many of you know what that now says? All right. Then in the streets or villages, and so forth. So why would Ralph Waldo Emerson want to be also involved with city facility and polish? By the way, it's an ideal not as brilliantly spoken by most, but shared by an awful lot of Americans over the course of American history. So there, you know, that's how you know him. That's how I knew him, transcendentalist. By the way, there are a couple of women who are rarely photographed, but they were also very instrumental in the transcendentalist movement. And it was, of course, you know, about self-reliance and all those things, not a mention of a city anywhere in anyone's description of what the transcendentalists were interested in. In fact, seemingly the opposite, right? So there he is. That's his home, right? In Concord. There's his buddy Thoreau over there hiding in Walden Pond. It's a little bit less pastoral these days, especially during the summer than it was when Mr. Thoreau was there. That was, of course, Emerson lived there. I think it was his uncle's house or a relative's house that he spent much of his latter part of his life living there.
On your slide, you have a beautiful statement on it. I didn't get to read the whole thing.
I believe this will be put online, and so there'll be a lot of words, and I won't be able to read all of them, but it's to kind of enhance those who might be able to look at the whole presentation later on as well, right? These are just read the red stuff. Those are the kind of the sort of inclinations of the transcendentalists, right? I'm not sure why this black line is up there. I wish I could get rid of it, but I'm not sure how. What's that? I'm not sure how to, I don't want to exit out of anything because
Move your mouse
The thing is, I
to
can't,
that X and click it.
yeah, all right,
Perfect, thank you.
and then like,
And then actually, can you go across to the little box and do the line?
the thing is that whoops. See, the little arrow doesn't appear on the screen, so somehow. Anyway, we have to get back to JP from Concord. How are we going to do that, right? All right. So there's how we know him, or how history has sort of recorded him. Well, guess what? He spent a period of his time not too far away, about a little bit more than a mile from here, in what is now Franklin Park. Actually, before that, he was another place not so far from here. He went to Latin as a young man, as did my daughter. And so, you know, in his early 20s, he wound up being a school teacher, which he hated. He wrote about how he disliked this. He also hated becoming a minister. He hated lots of things, actually, as it turns out, but not cities, oddly enough. All right. Again, approximately a couple more images that I'll show, a couple more maps that I'll show. So there he is. He's actually a part of the broader JP community in the 1820s. Actually, we think of Franklin Park as part of JP. It's technically part of Roxbury, but we'll ignore that at least for the next 45 minutes, right? So there you can see right there is approximately where his house was. A couple of older maps, which I'm always kind of interested in. Again, JP, this is you can see an 1835 map. He was already gone by that time there. And that happens to be, if we go here, that happens to be, this is a kind of direct comparison between today's map and, in this case, an 1840 map. There's Jamaica Plain. You can see actually the three streets that are still very much there. The rest of it is, of course, mostly rural, as you would expect. JP originally was a sort of farming area. And this is the area that is then assembled in the late 1880s and becomes Franklin Park. So again, some of you might know, Frederick Olmsted, the designer of parks all around the country, most famous, at least outside of Boston, most famous for Central Park in New York City. But towards the end of his life, actually, he's invited to come to Boston to do what he could not achieve in New York. He was always interested in a kind of a park system, nature that would somehow permeate the city, permeate the urban environment. You only got a couple of parks in New York, but Boston, the park commissioners, they actually were park commissioners before there were parks in Boston. Well, of course, the Common was there, Public Garden, invited him, and that set him up on what we all know and love, the creation of the Emerald Necklace. And in the 1890s, because he was an admirer of Emerson, he sort of tried to find the location of the house. By that time, it was no longer existing. And he then created a particular place. And I don't know how many of you have been there, but you should all go. It's kind of amazing, really. And he called it Schoolmasters at Hill Terrace in honor of the fact that Emerson, or I'll just call him Waldo, was a schoolmaster at the school, which he didn't like being, by the way. There is Schoolmaster Hill. It's actually an amazing little spot. You can see in the upper image, you can kind of tell where it is, I suppose, because that's the golf course, right? It's actually close to the road that sort of cuts Franklin Park in two. It's not as in a terrific shape as it was back in Olmsted's day. It actually was rebuilt in the 1960s, but some of the kind of wooden structures are no longer there. And there is, on this rock, as you go through the terrace, there's actually a plaque in honor of Emerson of JP, let's call him, in honor of the schoolmaster of Franklin Park. And this is very hard to read these days, even when you're standing there. It's actually a poem, one of the first poems that Olmsted wrote while he was living around us or near us. but was not published until the 1830s, late 30s, actually. Indeed, one of the passages from Nature, in the woods is perpetual youth. In the woods, we return to reason and faith. Actually, Franklin Park, or rather the landscape that preceded Franklin Park, got him going on his writing about nature. So we can adopt him. We can absolutely adopt him, right? Indeed, there's a number of historians see that there's the germination of his ideas about nature were part of the fact that he didn't like school teaching, but sat there and looked out over the Franklin Park landscape before it was a park, and actually began to write some of his earliest writings, which he then adapts later as he becomes a kind of a famous orator, author, poet, and so forth, philosopher. Right? Okay, but now that brings us back to then this, right? So where did Waldo want to be? Well, it turns out that, again, it's not mentioned very often. He was actually a very sort of a great traveler. He traveled through the American South, was one of the kind of critics of the slave economy and so forth. He traveled twice in his life, took 2 long trips to Europe, and went through and saw all the capitals, Paris, Rome, London, and so forth. Met many of the sort of comparable philosophers in those locations. Right? He never lived in New York, right? But the question is, okay, I wish for rural strength and religion somewhere up in here, and city facility and polish somewhere in a place like that, maybe. So how do we figure out why he said this? We have to go back a couple of centuries. We actually have to go back to the founding of the finding, at least by Caucasians, of the New World, the so-called New World, right? So look, utopia, the great sort of image of a perfect place, was actually inspired by the early sort of Columbus travels through the New World. There's a kind of an ancient map. This says that Die Welt, the New World, that's where it was. And there is a kind of a not so atypical expectation at the time back in Europe, right? With the discovery of America, we shall find, well, Christ, which, by the way, Waldo was not a fan of. I hate to break this to you. To nature, we will discover back to nature, and we will discover the paradise. And there was a sort of a moment, actually, a moment lasting probably a century or more, that the expectation might, well, where was paradise had to be somewhere. It had to be somewhere. Where was it? Possibly it might be in the so-called New World, right? So again, those of you who might remember Ponce de Leon, what was he seeking? The fountain of youth. It's amazing what you can find on Google, right? Yeah, there it is, right? There it is. So, it's important to understand that the origins of this part of the world had to do with the expectations of some kind of utopian way to recover from all the kind of problems of the prior sort of centuries of human existence and its constraints, and to come to something new and innocent, maybe. Well, about a century before Emerson, actually, maybe half a century, even less, depending upon how you identify. These are the kind of famous philosophers of the Enlightenment. And if you read these names, boy, that's a pretty impressive list. Very impressive list. We could even add 3 of our founders to the list, at least, right? Who actually intellectually were the kind of let's call them the colleagues, if you will, right? The intellectual colleagues, or equivalents of this. So what was the discovery of the age of enlightenment? It has something to do with Emerson's wish, indirectly. Well, they were about reason and science. They were about liberty and equality. They were about self-sufficiency. That sounds like the transcendentalists. I'll skip the property part. They were about finding finding insight and knowledge not always in the Bible, but in nature itself. And they were after something called the ethic of the middle link. The ethic of the middle link, what the heck would that be, right? Well, it had something to do with this, right? So yes, the wilderness. Oh my God, read about Thoreau up in Mount Katahdin. He didn't like it up there. Yes, nature, but also foreboding and dangerous. We must convert it into a garden. At the same time, cities, yes, fabulous, but how to avoid the kind of corrosive aspects of civilization, some of which we're experiencing now, but not to jump into that a puddle here, right? So the ethic of the middle link was some sort of place where you could sort of recover the benefits of the natural world once you convert it to garden, but also separate yourself out a little bit from the negative aspects of urbanization. So back to the transcendentalists, they were talking about creating a nature's nation in the garden of the world, not in the wilderness, in the garden of the world. Right? And so, read, here lies the pleasant middle ground, the ethic of the middle link. Here lies the pleasant middle ground, if through which, if you will have it so, get you to the Garden of Eden, where it merges into the city of God. Okay, that sounds all pretty good. But over the course, especially the second half of the 19th century, not everyone wanted to be a kind of a farmer or was able to make a go of it, right? And so as the industrialization took primacy, farmland and all these gardens made were being abandoned largely by the great lures of the modern city. In this case, showing an image of Chicago, actually, just in case you might be wondering. Right? But my goodness, the industrial city was not too terrific of a place for most. And so in the city, its humanity began to suggest that we need to kind of maybe be a little bit careful about cities and possibly maybe get us back to some sort of more of a kind of pastoral, if not the wilderness. Right? And guess what that led to? That kind of desire to, that kind of cultural mobility from the farm to the city not being all that terrific for most, and some still would say that today. Americans have never actually loved cities all that much. Not like a Parisian espousing, his love for Paris. Well, that got us to the suburb, is what it got us to. I won't read you all these quotes. They're all 19th century quotes about how lovely it would be if we all had a suburban extent. Here's Olmsted. Olmsted's thought about as a great kind of city builder, right? Through his parks and so forth. I'll just read that one. It's kind of the middle one there, I guess, right? Although this is too small for me to read because I take my glasses off, right? The most attractive, the most refined, the most soundly wholesome forms of domestic life and the best application of the arts of civilization in which mankind has yet attempted, right, or achieved. And he's talking about a suburb in Baltimore. Not Baltimore, Buffalo, in Buffalo, as he was invited there to kind of create a park system for Buffalo, right before he comes to Boston, actually, and works in there. So that's in the 19th century. That was the kind of great expectation. That's where the ethic of the middle link would be found for modern society. Not paradise, perhaps, but perhaps something better than either extreme. So here's a kind of a more recent, this is a book that just came out about 10 years ago, Great American Suburbs, with the very best of two worlds of town and countryside. One is not forced to choose to be either a country cousin or a city cousin. One can become a suburbanite. Right? Oddly, it's a book written by a couple of folks, and most of the photographs are of Dallas, of all places. And they have some nice, actually, the whole city is sort of suburban in a sense, right? Much more described. All right. But what did the great expectation of creating the suburb produce for us? Well, sprawl, a great sort of problem of the second half of the 20th century into the 21st century. Sprawl, neither, you might say, neither, right? City facility and polish or religion. And it's doubtful whether, of course, Emerson would be a great supporter of suburban America. It's doubtful. But we've kind of been a very paradoxical nation. On the one hand, cities are cool, great, fortunes lie, careers lie, spouses are to be found, whatever you wish, right? At the same time, we kind of like to hang out with the chickens in our garden. And at the same time, right, look, bomb the suburbs of all of our city lovers amongst us, perhaps many of you, right? I'm usually called a city slicker, actually, because I've taught about cities, more or less. And look at this, cities are great, my goodness, fabulous. Cities are abnormal. And one can fill a whole library of books like this, titled like this, and titled like that, which is why this is actually one of my favorite books about American urban history. It's not quite old. And he was a great historian. He called us people of paradox. Right? So let me introduce you, and again, I wonder if I'll be able to read it. Let me introduce you to a person of paradox, not Waldo. He's still coming in quickly. There he is. Look at this gentleman. Wow. He is an urbanist for sure, an urbanite. And so he did spend most of his time in Manhattan. He was a very important individual. He was a Pulitzer Prize winning author. He was an attaché to President Wilson. He actually wrote about national inequalities and so forth. So there it is. Apparently a consummate urbanite. Well, that's now he's writing under his pseudonym. And I would like to read this because it actually makes me cry. Don't follow me in that, right? Right, you can see, not under his own name, because under his own name, he had to be this. One morning, I awakened with a strange new joy in my soul. Sounds like Emerson. It came to me at that moment with indescribable poignancy, the thought of walking barefoot in cool, fresh plow furrows, as I had once done when a boy. So vividly the memory came. I thought of sitting in the quiet thickets in old fence corners, the wood behind me rising still, cool, mysterious, and the fields in front stretching away in illimitable pleasantness. I thought of the good smell of cows and milking. You do not know if you do not know. I thought of the sights and sounds of the heat and sweat of the hayfields. I thought of a certain brook I knew when a boy that flowed among elders and wild parsnips, where I waded in with my 3-foot rod for trout. I thought of all these things as a man thinks of his first love. It's an amazing passage. An amazing passage who was a consummate urbanist for much of his life. Mr. Baker. Well, now I have to reveal something that I've kept from you. That statement by Mr. Emerson, there's no period after polish. There's no period there. He continued, I find with chagrin that cannot have both. Well, for him and for most Americans since him, the suburb was not the middle landscape. The suburb was not the ethic of the middle link, right? But JP is. And, you know this. Which is why I think that once reincarnated, he would be among us today. And so I'm essentially, the rest of it needs not be said because you know this even better than I, right? We have a great commercial street. Somehow, I don't know if it's still a secret, but it seems to have been a secret back in 2015. We are surrounded by the other, by parks. I love this map because it's actually not truthful. It says JP, Franklin Park is in JP. It's technically not. It's technically in Roxbury as long as you see the neighborhoods. But hey, we can believe it to be here, right? That's actually my wife and me and our son actually walking her to her breast cancer thingamajigs at the LMA. You can walk from here, at least from where we live, to the greatest collection of healthcare centers in the country, if not the world. And she's fine, by the way, she's okay. So we have a great commercial street, city facility and polish. We have, well, if not religion yet, we certainly have, or farming, but that's actually not what he meant. He meant this kind of pastoral condition. He did not believe in Christ. Emerson did not believe in Christ, or rather he did not believe that Christ was the Son of God because he felt that God was within all of us. We were all children, right, of God. He was invited he attended Harvard too as a young man. He was invited years later to a divinity school. And he said this. Oh, the outrage. He actually was not invited back for 30 years, literally 30 years, after saying that God lives in all of us. He was considered an atheist by the divinity school for a while. So anyway, we have a commercial street on the one hand, city facility and polish. We have all more open space around us and within our neighborhood and any city, any neighborhood in Boston, if not the country. We enjoy these places in innumerable ways, including in some spectacular ways. If those of you seem like a relatively older crowd, if you had kids, once in a while when you all had young kids, right? This is an amazing annual event. We have, kind of everyday needs mostly satisfied. We have all kinds of everyday things. Some, kind of exotic, some very or normal. Even the juxtaposition of some of our sort of commercial spaces in our homes as well. We have an incredible assortment of housing types, from the grand to the humble, almost the size of the cabin that Emerson lived in back then before Franklin Park. Truly, as I've done the last couple of weeks, actually, there's an incredible array of housing types, much greater than in most neighborhoods. There's homes for those of us who are better off, let us say, or I assume, I don't know. And there are places for those who are not so well off, but maybe are doing reasonably well. Again, there's old-fashioned housing. People, there's a problem in the American language, which is that a home sounds good. That's what we all expect to have. Housing means something else. It's for others. It's not for us. It's like public housing. In Europe, it's called social housing, but in a positive way. So there's actually a problem. When we say housing, there's a kind of a suggestion that we're not yet able to acquire what we actually want, which is a home. But we have an array of housing. One of the great housing prototypes, really, in the United States, the triple decker. It's kind of amazing. And there's, if you don't know, 3 of them are being built right now near here, which I think is marvelous. You could imagine yourself to be in the country. I don't know whether any of the owners of these places are in the room, but that would be interesting, right? But you don't need to raise your hand, right? At the same time, again, we have buses, not to mention the Orange Line when it works, right? And post offices. And we have some semblance still, not as much as perhaps we should have, but some still of the old industrial era of Jamaica Plain, now repurposed for other purposes that are essential to some of us today, like aerobic activity and overpriced coffee. We have religion too. So amongst the urban planning professions right now, there's a new soundbite. There's a brand new soundbite. And it's called the 15-minute city. Now that, of course, is ridiculous because that's a village. And not many of us would still want to move back to a village. Maybe, I don't know. So actually, what we are missing in this country globally, really, or broadly, not globally, right, is a sense of 15-minute neighborhoods. And so this is a diagram produced by the American Planning Association that talks about, it's called a 15-minute city, but I think that should be struck down and called a neighborhood. And look at all those things that you may wish to find within a 10, 15, maybe 20-minute walk. Not even the need for an automobile, at least for daily activities, right? And we have those here. We actually have those here. Sometimes we forget to appreciate them, I think. So for example, I've kind of spent, so there's our house, right? And I kind of spent some time trying, if you go onto, what is it called? Earth Pro or Google Earth, right? You can measure distances, right? So I was measuring the distances like to the subway, to the Orange Line, which I use every day, or at least when I was more active in my company. From the Orange Line to a boathouse, to a post office, not to mention to both sides of Center Street and so forth. That's amazing. And some of you ought to do the same diagram from your homes. We also, even today, even with gentrification, which is increasing, JP more or less corresponds to the demographics of America, which is interesting. And, not true up in the Back Bay or Beacon Hill, or actually not even in most neighborhoods in Boston. You can look it up, right? Now, there's a kind of a humbug in the room, of course, as some of you I'm sure know. This is an amazing cartoon. I love cartoons. They're quicker to get to the points often than anything else, right? Starter home, for sale, you can't afford it, right? This is why it's called the American dream, because you can't afford it. That's why it's a dream, right? Not the American reality. So that is a major issue. And in some places worse than it is in JP, but also, of course, it is also not very good in JP as well. We are in the midst of a whole series of crises in this country, and I will not run through this list. We'll all get very, very sad. But housing is pretty much at the center of much of it, right? Where indeed much of us, or my kids, for example, my 2 adult kids, are unlikely in the next, whatever, 20 years, who knows? They certainly wouldn't be able to afford JP unless I kick off, I guess. or until, right, I should say, not unless, until. And we're building housing, and I hope that there are not too many NIMBYs in the room, of which there are in many communities. We're building housing. What's a NIMBY? Not in my backyard. All the folks who tend to oppose, development. But look at this. I don't know how many of you know this. We still have room for at least 10,000 more. You can see, 1950, 56,000 people. And by the way, Boston at the time was 800,000. By 1970, it was down to 500,000 because 300,000 of us decided we would rather go to the Sun Belt or to the suburbs or to participate in the white flight era. And of course, you can see a similar condition happen in JP. But of course, we're kind of recovering. So that's it. I'm done because I believe that Waldo's wish for rural strength and religion and city facility and polish may be found right here in JP. Thank you. So I was supposed to speak for 45 minutes, and I guess I did that more or less, right? Well, actually, gee, I have 4 more minutes. Yeah. So I think some Q&A, right? And perhaps there are some people who were too cowardly to go through the cold air and are with us on Zoom, right? Okay, so please. Please.
That was great, Alex. Thank you very much. My question is, why did you skip over the property ownership category? Because it feels like it's somewhere in the Michigan.
Well, what do you mean by skipping over it?
You actually said in the list of beliefs that Emerson and his colleagues maintained, there was property ownership and as a way to control personal economics or something like that was listed. And you said, I'll skip over that, and you went to the next one. So I'm just curious, and the answer was not discussed. So I guess I'm wondering if you have a reason for that, or just it wasn't relevant today.
Oh, no. Could I repeat the question? No. Okay, actually, I know what you mean, and it had. Oh, you mean the Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment folks, right? Whoops! I wish I.
Pursuit of the concept of property as a source of wealth and personally.
Nothing. Nothing at all. Nothing at all. Nothing about it. That's not why I skipped over it. I actually thought you were referring to something else that was going to be in the presentation that clearly is not. In the Declaration of Independence. Should we go back to that? We can, what the heck, this is easy, right? In my various ideals, right? So actually, right. So in the original draft of the Declaration, Jefferson writes, life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. And actually about 19 state constitutions still have that in their constitution. And it's not, I'm not against property at all, right? But it's kind of interesting that somehow the belief by Jefferson, but by the way, he changed it because it sounded better, doesn't it? It sounds better. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness with property.
Well, happiness isn't necessarily generated with things.
Yes, right. No, and so what, and you'll have to kind of come back for my talk about Thomas Jefferson, an incredible human being and a slaveholder as well, right? Sort of connect those two.
So people realize that some of them.
Yes, he did. He fathered 6 children, 4 of whom made it into adulthood. So his notion, wow, I'm amazed that his notion was his notion was that every American should be given 160 acres of land. a quarter section was called. Some of you might remember that name, a quarter section of land, 160 acres, which is a quarter of a mile square. And he set out a survey that more or less gridded the entirety of the United States into these mile square grids. And the expectation was that as long as each family was able to get its quarter section of land, actually happiness would ensue. The Homestead Act, which was passed right around the Civil War era, this is just Jefferson's idea, but the Homestead Act was so passed, and actually about 4.5 million people acquired their quarter section of land between the 1860s and actually 1910 or so through the Homestead Act. His sense was, of course, that as long as we are all landholders, not slightly different in property, we would be set. And of course, the America's greatest architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, who talked about always about how an acre for each, including your descendants. I'd like to give an acre of land to my 2 kids, by the way. The funny thing is that this was an utopian notion about equality. But once property became a kind of the opposite almost, a speculative way to make money, all of a sudden that idealism, right, sort of withers away. So if Thomas Jefferson and our founders assumed each of us and another 300 million of us owned 160 acres kind of equally across the land, some of those 160 acres wouldn't be worth very much because, right, especially during climate change, right? But if I were to show you a plan, I should have brought it. I should have brought it to answer your question, right? Like 1% of property owners have the entire west half of the country. And about 60% of us, if not more, have a tiny little square, own collectively a tiny little square in the middle of Texas or wherever you want to place it, right? So there's a kind of a dilemma there about property becoming not home ownership, right? But the idea of property not as a way to happiness, but as a kind of speculative mechanism that actually has increased inequality and doing so even more today than ever before. So I hope I answered that question. So a couple more. Oh, yes. Yeah. Oh, I don't know the exact number, but a tremendous amount, about 7 miles worth of demolition took place. So certainly a couple of thousand units, I'm sure, but I don't have the exact number, right? And you all know what happened there, some of you, right? Why did it stop? Well, yes, but which people? No. No. Huh? Excuse me? Tommy Lee. There are certain heroes, and some of us are still among us, right? But you have to understand that you were supported and actually enhanced by Brookline people and Cambridge people, because the idea was not just 95 going through, which is what caused all the demolition in Roxbury and JP. It was to connect to a little inner belt, of which the central artery, if you remember that, was the first arc. And as soon as and of course there are lots of great protests and lots of great heroes and lots of great opposition, it wasn't actually very effective until it was joined by folks in Brookline Village, because the demolition was about to start there. And especially in Cambridge, where that highway is going to pass through between Central Square and Harvard Square. And again, if some of you who are old enough might have a vague memory of, if you're on 93 heading north, right out of town, there's this kind of ramp flied over into nowhere. That was going to go right through the middle of Cambridge and through Brookline Village. and then through JP and Roxbury to connect to 95. So yes, people, yes, JP people, yes, Roxbury people, yes, Connolly and others, but it was a good thing in a way, historically speaking, that all of a sudden you had all kinds of allies with even more political yeah. Yes, that's true. These days, it sounds rather remarkable. Governor Sargent, and what did he do with the money? Well, exactly. And again, I don't want to turn this into an homage for Sargent, but he was actually, no, but it's okay, right? He was the first person ever, the first state official ever, who stopped a Department of Transportation project. By the way, the Department of Transportation really should mean Department of Highways.
Yeah.
He was the first person, the first official who said, no, but I'm keeping the money. That was the amazing act, right? I'm keeping the money. And that's when the several extensions of the red line, the green lines, took place by the money that was not spent on the inner belt, as it was called, and the I-95 connector. Yeah, right. So we need somebody like that. We need somebody like that to capture some money and do the same, especially, and get the gauge right on future tracks, right? Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's great. And I guess I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to phrase this question, but
I wasn't exactly sure how I was going to talk about Emerson and JP, but you know, go ahead. Go ahead.
Show the graphic of the 15-minute neighborhood.
Yes.
Sort of talking about, you know, a lot of, I mean, I love living here for 30 years and all the housing diversity. But one of the things that's so wonderful about living here is the social fabric.
Yeah.
And I wonder how that came in, you know, I'm not an expert in the transcendentalist, but it's about nature and individual happiness. And how is the social fabric and sort of the social history incorporated into this picture in your thinking?
Well, it was also in the transcendentalist thinking. If you felt good about yourself in relationship to the nature and your soul and the natural world and the world outside were somehow in harmony, you would become a more socially engaged individual. That was Olmsted felt the same, by the way. He said that, and I think it even appeared quickly, parks would make you better citizens. Now, you can debate that a little bit. So no, all of those folks in the 19th century thought that by kind of finding a way of making peace with nature on the one hand, but also civilization advancing on the other hand, that would kind of return us to this kind of archaic state, the ethical middle link, where we would be in peace with each other and with the world, and therefore as a result also with our neighbors. So I didn't dwell on that very much, but I hope that I didn't suggest that they were asocial. They were not libertarians. The transcendentalists were not libertarians. Right? I don't believe.
Just to comment on Olmsted.
Yes.
Where I'm in New Jersey,
Uh-huh.
he's responsible for developing many parks since they're.
Oh, yes.
And those neighborhoods do indeed create that sense of community, and you can see the marked difference between those communities and the ones that are not embodied with this.
Yeah.
I'm gonna say this fuller, well-rounded model.
Yeah, and you know, look at the pandemic actually made us all realize how important open space and open space in proximity to where we are, how important it was. Sure, yes, so yes, but please.
Is your book, does your book have a lot about JP in it, or is it?
No.
a spin-off?
No, it's a spin-off.
Okay.
No,
What's your book?
Hey,
Well-
It's about
well,
parks and cities?
well, yes. Well, the subtitle, oh, now it's too far away. The subtitle is called urban idealism in America from the Puritans to the present. It's actually a story of, there are a couple of chapters on Boston, but it's about the fact that there's a certain idealism that has existed in American culture since, of course, the discovery of the New World. But oftentimes it is not sort of, it's hard in the end to create utopias. So it's a story about efforts to try to create a better world and how they've succeeded on occasion and also how they've sort of, failed on occasion. There's a chapter called Renewing Urban Renewal. Right? Who would write a chapter about urban renewal, right? I mean, it was horrible. It was a horrible moment. Renewal, exactly, right. Horrible consequences. But actually, there's a kind of a certain misplaced idealism, right? Which is that we can make things better by making them new. That's a really old American ideal. We will improve things by making them new. Edward Logue, some of you might remember, he was, and it's actually a very good book that just came out a couple of years ago called Saving America's Cities, which is kind of a slightly revised history of Logue, as historians tend to do after 50 years, right? Examine things in a slightly kind of different way at the time, right? He would say things like, you can't make an omelet without cracking some eggs. He actually borrowed that from Stalin, or at least Stalin was supposedly the first person who said something like that. And by the way, it's true, right? It's hard to make an omelet without, but did he ask the eggs, right? If you will, right? So there's a kind of there's a fault in American culture, which is actually what the book is about, right? Which is this, things always begin in a kind of an idealistic, back to, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and, we're all one and so forth. And then, but how it is put into practice tends to kind of defeat that idealism. So the book is about that. And it uses it talks about Olmsted. There's a chapter on Olmsted. There's a chapter on urban renewal. There's another chapter called Utopia, which is a term that Disney discovered. I mean, not discovered, coined. And there's still in some of the parks in Disneyland. There's a ride called Utopia, and kids get to maneuver on their vehicles, right? It was. I mean, think about this. By the way, I love to kind of go to all the cyclist advocates these days a little bit, even though I'm a pretty avid cyclist myself, right? Who was the principal proponents for the four-wheeled vehicle? 1880s, 1890s cyclists and cyclist organizations, because they saw it as a great enhancement on this two-wheel thing that, was actually kind of hard to get around in certain, like today, say. So there's a way in which, so mobility is another of these sort of great American ideals. But there are, as an economist would say, unintended consequences, right? Which have been experiencing as a result of believing in personal mobility. But if you say personal mobility, that sounds pretty darn good, right? And maybe one day we'll all be able to kind of, drone ourselves to wherever we want to be, right? So the book is more about these sort of notions that are very characteristic of American society, including, Emerson's wish, right? But that are actually very hard to effectuate and maintain without needing to adjust. So that's what that book's about. There's a book called Mapping Boston, which is about Boston. So, but that's now kind of 20 years old. Yes. Oh, sure. Well, I'm not that old. I actually never spoke with Mr. Emerson. Close, but no. Again, this is why I mentioned that he was a very, very consummate traveler. He visited many cities. By the way, also like Jefferson, Jefferson is considered a great, supporter for rural America, right? A republic An American Republic was about farming, right? That's why we all needed 160 acres, right? But he loved his 5 years in Paris. He just loved his 5 years when he was ambassador to France, right? Before he became president. Right? So I believe that what he meant, and you'd have to ask Waldo, I believe that what he meant was that, the sophistication and complexity and diversity and the kind of the exchange that takes place, if you use that word in its broadest sense, in cities, is what you missed when you're sitting out there in Walden Pond in some hut. I don't remember what was Thoreau also known for? Stealing apple pies from neighbors. They were being cooled on the ledges, right? So you need society. In a sense, you're saying you need society. And that has to be the balance to becoming one with nature. But that's my guess. Yes.
This is like one of these ideas, but it goes along with this one vision of isolation, which homogeneous movements, and sort of staying just within a little bubble.
Well,
that's sort of speaks to me without I just want to.
Well, it's a good point. It depends upon how you interpret this, obviously. It's a good point. By the way, oh gosh, Sinclair, I can't think of the name of it now, a book about Sinclair Lewis, Main Street, right? So it's written about 1920s, right? And it's about a young woman hating her village, absolutely hating her village and desiring to make it to the big city because it is in fact homogeneous and stifling. And there's, at one point she says something like, there's no one of interest that will walk by my porch. Sinclair has an amazing sentence at the end, something like, it is stillness made God. Stillness may be okay sometime, but so this is part of this kind of a paradoxical condition, right? So most of the villages were abandoned in the 19th century and still are. There are many that still are being abandoned because of the very thing that there's not a sufficient amount of Emerson's second part of Emerson's wish, right? Well, not the third part, it's the second part, right? City, facility, and polish. But at the same time, in the modern city, you miss the convenience of many things and many different kinds of people and so forth. And if Boston, and actually Boston is better than many American cities, right? That has a sense of these, and even some of our older towns that we now call suburban, right? Whatever, Brookline even, so forth, right? That's why I think that a city made up of not homogeneous neighborhoods, but sort of neighborhoods that actually provide a certain amount of convenience that makes other things, like always having to get in your car or always having to kind of work twice as hard to get somewhere and so forth, is a good idea, as long as, yes, you're right, as long as they don't become too homogeneous, sure. So yes, you should read Main Street. It'll convince you of your point. Stillness made God, right? Pardon? Well, there you go, right? Yes, exactly. Yeah, well, that's part of this sort of this oscillation. You might say even the history of American civilization has been this oscillation between extremes, which actually Emerson wanted to and couldn't find a way himself in his life, but wished he could combine. Yeah.
It's very hard to bridge the two.
Yes, it is. It is. Yes. And the suburb turned out to be not the best idea, although, half of American society lives seemingly fairly happily out there. Yeah. So, oh, yes, please. Yeah.
Is that also density by building it? Or it's not a loss of actual revenue.
It's actually a loss of people per unit.
Yeah.
Yes, right. There's a little trick there. Yes, that's right. Yes.
That's really important because,
Yeah.
we
Yes.
have further occupation of people per unit in our units.
Well, it's two things. It's smaller families for sure. And more hoggish in terms of the square footage that we think we need. You know, the
But it
typical,
also means that you are building much more density to accommodate the same number of people.
yeah, yes, 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 yes,
That's
yes. So what is the average square footage of a home being built in America right now? Yes.
Country.
Anyway, the average in the nation. No. Yeah, you're right. Right, yeah. What was the average of the Levittown home? We tend to be very negative about those things. That was, by the way, the most affordable housing ever constructed. Oddly enough, right? What's the Levittown? What's that? 1,100. And in subsequent phases, it got to be up to 1,500 right now. What's the average dwelling size in China right now?
Because it depends upon where you are in the world and what people
Yeah.
are accustomed
Yeah,
to.
so again, it's smaller people per unit for sure, absolutely, right? But it's also this kind of partially out of need and partially out of being able to get away with it, much more space. Yeah, than perhaps, you know.
I have a theory that that's part of what creates NIMBYs rather than the actual.
Yeah,
That's another.
that's another topic, right? I'm just trying to avoid the NIMBYs syndrome, but yes, yeah, yes. Oh, I'm getting the. No, but you're a dear friend, so go ahead.
I'm curious about your definition of suburb, because in many respects, there are different parts of the city in general, like Jamaica Plain, that one might consider first generation
Yeah,
suburbs,
Yeah.
and those places were not 1,100 square feet or.
of
or
course,
ideal
right,
for,
right.
you know,
Yeah. Actually, the term suburb at the moment is so probably lost its significance as a word, because there are many different kinds of suburbs, right? There are lots of new developments under the aegis of something called the new urbanism, and I don't know, there's a group of people out there who are saying we need to kind of reform our suburbs by adding mixed uses to them, right? So I guess when I use the term suburb in its kind of negative characteristics, essentially a single family home, large lots development, which, you know, probably 60% of suburbs are like that. But we're learning, you know, you could even say you could have 15-minute suburbs. And there's some that are being attempted to be developed, right? So I guess you're accusing me of rightly by saying, no, I'm saying that suburb, don't use the word suburb anymore because it needs a couple of adjectives these days, yes. Or urban edge.
Urban edge, you know, I live in Windsor, not quite the suburb,
Yeah.
it's not the city.
Yeah.
Referred to as urban edge.
Yeah. Yes, I'm talking about better communities versus more mixed.
We like
Okay,
to
I'm-
call it in-town living.
In-town
Yeah,
living.
because you can walk to anything in town.
I'm getting an even more extreme.
No, I was coming in to take all those.